Imagine a battle so monumental it echoes across centuries, a clash of titans where the fate of an entire people hangs in the balance, a story woven into the very soul of a nation. Throughout history, legendary conflicts have defined cultures, forged identities, and given rise to myths so powerful they transcend time itself. But few tales carry the raw, primal weight of the struggles buried deep within Celtic mythology, where gods, monsters, and heroes collide in an epic dance of creation and destruction. Today, we journey into the heart of one of these foundational conflicts, the mythic struggle that would determine the destiny of Ireland itself, the Battle of Mag Tuired. This isn't just a story of swords and shields. It's a saga of cosmic order versus chaos, a divine war between the mysterious and oppressive Fomorians and the noble, determined Tuatha Dé Danann. It's a narrative steeped in magic, sacrifice, and the kind of larger-than-life heroism that has captivated listeners for over 1,000 years. And to make this exploration even more thrilling, we're celebrating a huge milestone. You, this incredible community, have brought us to 1,000 subscribers. To thank you for being part of this journey into myth and meaning, we're launching a massive giveaway with prizes that echo the legendary themes we're about to uncover. One lucky winner will receive a stunning hardcover collection of Celtic myths, a $50 gift card to unlock more adventures in storytelling, and an exclusive digital art piece inspired by the mythic beings you'll meet today. Entering is simple, just stay tuned until the end of the video for all the details on how to throw your name into the cauldron of fate. So settle in, open your imagination, and let the drums of war and wonder carry you back to a time when gods walked the earth and every battle held the power to shape the world. This is the story of the Second Battle of Mag Tuired. Before we plunge into the epic confrontation between the Tuatha Dé Danann and the Fomorians, it's crucial to understand that the very ground we're talking about, the plain of Mag Tuired, was actually the stage for two separate, world-altering conflicts in Irish mythology. The first of these battles is a dramatic and often overlooked prologue to the main event. This initial clash saw the Tuatha Dé Danann, arriving in Ireland on dark clouds of mist, come face to face with the Fir Bolg, the current rulers of the land. The Fir Bolg were a powerful people in their own right, and they fiercely defended their homeland. The battle was brutal and costly, resulting in the loss of the Tuatha Dé king Nuada, who had his hand severed by the Fir Bolg champion Esreng. Though the Tuatha Dé Danann ultimately claimed victory, it was a Pyrrhic one, secured only after they agreed to cede 1/4 of the island back to the Fir Bolg. This first battle established the Tuatha Dé as the new rulers, but it also left them weakened and their king physically imperfect, setting the stage for a period of uncertainty and a much greater threat on the horizon. That greater threat, of course, was the Fomorians, and their inevitable confrontation with the Tuatha Dé Danann forms the Second Battle of Mag Tuired. While the first battle was a struggle for territorial control between two human-like peoples, the second is something else entirely. It's the mythic clash that has resonated for millennia, a foundational story of order versus chaos, of light against darkness, and of a people's desperate fight for their very sovereignty. This is the battle that features gods wielding unstoppable weapons, acts of incredible personal sacrifice, and the intervention of monstrous supernatural forces. It's not merely a war, it's a cosmological event that defines the character of the Irish pantheon and explains the nature of the world itself. The Second Battle of Mag Tuired is iconic because it transcends a simple war story, evolving into a rich, symbolic narrative about resilience, unity, and the high price of securing a homeland, themes that have echoed throughout Irish history and cemented this myth as a cornerstone of Celtic cultural identity. So who were these would-be conquerors who emerged from the fog? The Tuatha Dé Danann, whose name translates to the people of the goddess Donu, were far more than just another tribe seeking land. They represented the very essence of the divine, a pantheon of skilled and powerful beings who would become the gods of the Irish world. Their arrival was nothing short of miraculous, a scene designed to strike awe and fear into the hearts of those who witnessed it. Ancient texts describe how they descended upon the coast of Connacht in a great, dark mist that blotted out the sun for 3 days, appearing not in ships but as if they had stepped directly out of the sky itself. This dramatic entrance was a clear declaration that they were not ordinary mortals. They were beings of magic, knowledge, and immense power, arriving to claim what they believed was their rightful inheritance. Their claim to Ireland was backed not just by force, but by 4 legendary relics, each a symbol of their sovereignty and a source of their otherworldly strength. These treasures were the anchors of their power. First was the Stone of Fall, known as the Lia Fail, which would let out a mighty roar when the true High King of Ireland stood upon it. Then came the unbreakable sword of their king, Nuada. Once drawn, no one could escape it, and it would inevitably guarantee victory in battle. The third treasure was the deadly spear of Lugh, though he had not yet arrived among them. This spear was so thirsty for blood it had to be sedated with a potion of poppy leaves when not in use to keep it from raging on its own. And finally, there was the bottomless cauldron of the Dagda, a vessel that could produce an endless supply of food and from which no company ever went away unsatisfied. These objects weren't mere weapons or tools, they were instruments of destiny, affirming the Tuatha Dé Danann's divine right to rule. Yet for all their power and majesty, they were profoundly, almost humanly flawed. This paradox is what makes them so compelling. They possessed incredible skills in magic, art, and science, yet they were prone to jealousy, pride, and error. Their greatest weakness was revealed in that first battle against the Fir Bolg, when their noble king, Nuada, lost his hand. This physical imperfection under their own laws made him unfit to rule as High King, creating a vacuum of leadership at the most precarious time. It exposed a critical vulnerability and a rigid adherence to their own codes, showing that even gods could be crippled by their own dogma. This internal flaw set the stage for their greatest challenge, forcing them to seek out a new kind of leader, one whose arrival would become the stuff of legend itself. They were powerful, but they were incomplete, setting in motion the events that would bring a dazzling, multi-talented stranger to their gates. But if the Tuatha Dé Danann were the dazzling, if flawed, champions of order and skill, then their enemies, the Fomorians, were their absolute antithesis. They were not a nation in any conventional sense, but a terrifying primordial force, a chaotic and monstrous collection of beings who seemed to embody the cruel, uncaring power of the sea and the harshness of a barren winter. Where the Tuatha Dé were associated with light, art, and knowledge, the Fomorians represented raw, oppressive power for its own sake. They are consistently described in the most grotesque terms, not as uniformed soldiers, but as a horrifying horde of giants, many with a single eye, a single arm, and a single leg. Their bodies a chaotic patchwork of mismatched limbs that spoke of a nature utterly alien and horrifying to behold. They weren't just different, they were a walking perversion of natural form, a visual representation of the chaos they brought with them. Their role in the mythology is not merely that of invaders, but of cruel, parasitic overlords. Long before the main battle, they had established a system of brutal oppression over Ireland, demanding exorbitant and crippling tribute from its people. This wasn't a simple tax of grain or cattle. The Fomorians demanded a 2/3 portion of the island's children, its milk and its wheat. They essentially consumed the very future and sustenance of the land, leaving its inhabitants in a state of perpetual subjugation and fear. This system of tribute established them not just as foreign enemies to be fought on a battlefield, but as a pervasive blight, a constant drain on the lifeblood of the country that had to be utterly eradicated for any hope of freedom to flourish. Leading this nightmarish host was the most fearsome of them all, Balor of the Evil Eye. Balor was a king and a warrior, but his true power was a weapon of mass destruction that was part of his very body. He possessed one eye that was normally kept shut with 7 heavy lids, for it was so venomous and destructive that merely opening it would unleash a lethal, sweeping gaze that could decimate entire armies on the spot. The mythology around this eye is deeply chilling. It was said to have been poisoned by the fumes from a magical potion he was forced to brew, transforming it into a tool of instant, indiscriminate death. He was the Fomorians' ultimate weapon, a walking siege engine whose very presence on the battlefield made victory seem almost impossible for any who would dare to oppose him. His existence elevated the conflict from a simple war for territory into a desperate struggle for survival against a seemingly unstoppable force of annihilation. The battlefield was a chaotic tapestry of clashing steel and desperate cries, a brutal contest of wills between the invading Tuatha Dé Danann and the defending Fir Bolg. At the heart of this storm stood King Nuada, a sovereign leading his people not from a distant throne but from the front lines, his presence a beacon of courage and divine right. His legendary sword, one of the 4 great treasures, was a blur of unstoppable motion, a promise of victory with every swing. Yet even a king's promise can be broken in the grim lottery of war. The pivotal moment came not in a grand duel of champions announced by trumpets, but in the savage, intimate chaos of the melee. Esreng, a Fir Bolg warrior of immense strength and skill, found his opening. In a devastating exchange, his blade sheared through armor, flesh, and bone, severing Nuada's right hand from his arm. This was far more than a gruesome injury. It was a catastrophe that struck at the very foundation of Tuatha Dé Danann sovereignty. Their society operated under a sacred and unbreakable law, a jays which dictated that their high king must be physically perfect and without blemish. This concept of sacred wholeness was paramount. The king was not merely a political ruler but a symbolic embodiment of the land itself. A maimed king was seen as a flawed vessel, his imperfection a spiritual contagion that could bring drought, famine, and defeat upon his entire people. The land and its ruler were one, and an injured king meant a wounded nation. Despite leading his people to a hard-fought victory, Nuada's worthiness was irrevocably stripped away by his loss. His nobility, his battle prowess, and his leadership meant nothing in the face of this ancient, unbending decree. With immense honor and a heavy heart, the once great king was forced to lay down his crown and abdicate, creating a dangerous power vacuum at the most fragile moment in their history. This forced abdication set in motion a chain of events that would bring the Tuatha Dé Danann to the brink of ruin. Desperate for stability and a new leader to unite them, the council made a fateful and ultimately disastrous choice. They turned to a promising young noble named Bres, whose name ironically meant the Beautiful. His appeal was superficial but powerful. He was strikingly handsome and charismatic, appearing to be everything a king should be on the surface. More importantly, his lineage offered a tantalizing possibility of peace, for his father was a prince of the Tuatha Dé, but his mother was a Fomorian of noble blood. The council saw in Bres a potential bridge to their monstrous enemies, a diplomatic solution to avoid further conflict. They believed they could placate the Fomorians by placing a king with their blood on the throne. But Bres's reign swiftly revealed itself to be a cruel and oppressive joke. The handsome facade hid a soul of avarice and cold indifference. Any hope of peace through kinship was shattered as Bres transformed into a harsh and demanding tyrant, imposing back-breaking labor and humiliating tasks upon the Tuatha Dé Danann. He forced their greatest warriors to build fortresses, their Dagda to dig massive ditches, and their champions to fetch firewood like common servants. He showed no generosity, no hospitality, and no respect for the customs of his people. Worst of all, he levied the same kind of crippling tribute upon his own subjects that the Fomorians were infamous for, effectively turning the Tuatha Dé Danann into slaves in their own land. His half-Fomorian heritage was no longer a symbol of unity, but had become a clear vehicle for oppression, proving that the true corruption of the Fomorians was not in their monstrous appearance, but in their parasitic and tyrannical nature. The reign of King Bres, born from a king's sacrifice, became the very cause that made the second cataclysmic battle not just a possibility, but an absolute necessity for survival. And so the Tuatha Dé Danann, still licking their wounds from their costly victory, placed their future in the hands of a king who was beautiful to behold but hollow at his core. Bres, whose very name meant the beautiful, seemed like a perfect solution. With the striking looks of a born leader and a charismatic presence that promised stability, he appeared to be the handsome, youthful sovereign they desperately needed to unite them. His mixed heritage, being the son of a Tuatha Dé prince and a Fomorian noblewoman, was even seen as a potential advantage, a possible bridge to peace with their most formidable enemies. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed the gods had chosen wisely, selecting a ruler who could heal old wounds and usher in a new era of prosperity. This illusion of hope shattered almost immediately. The reign of King Bres revealed itself not as a golden age, but as a dark period of servitude and humiliation. The essential, sacred duty of any Irish king was generosity, the unwavering commitment to the prosperity of his people. A true king's wealth was not for hoarding but for distributing. His table was to be open to all, his hall a place of feasting and reward for his champions. Bres violated this fundamental contract with a cold, calculated greed. He became a miser, withholding wealth and hospitality, forcing the very gods and heroes he ruled to perform the work of common laborers. The mighty Ogma, champion of strength, was compelled to carry firewood. The Dagda, the father figure and master of magic, was forced to build a massive fortress and dig endless ditches. These were not acts of civic duty but deliberate humiliations, designed to break the spirit of the Tuatha Dé and assert his absolute tyrannical control. The oppression did not stop at forced labor. Bres instituted a system of tribute so cruel and excessive it mirrored the worst Fomorian practices. He demanded impossible payments of the land's bounty, not a simple tax, but a voracious consumption of its very life force. The milk of every cow, the wheat from every field, and even a portion of the children born to his people were seized and sent as offerings to his Fomorian kin. This was more than tyranny. It was a form of vampirism, where the king systematically drained the vitality of his own nation to feed the very monsters he was supposed to protect them from. The land itself began to suffer under his rule, with cows drying up and blight appearing on the crops, a direct reflection of the spiritual blight that had taken hold of the throne. The king was no longer the embodiment of the land's health, but the agent of its decay. This profound breach of sovereignty ignited a deep, smoldering resentment among the Tuatha Dé Danann. Their patience, worn thin by indignity and starvation, finally snapped. The first and most devastating blow to Bres's reign came not from a warrior's spear, but from the sharp, public satire of a poet. The renowned bard Quapa was granted an audience in the king's hall, expecting the traditional hospitality and reward for his art. Instead, he was housed in a small, leaky chamber and given a meager 3 dry cakes on a bare table. In response, Quapa unleashed the most powerful weapon in a poet's arsenal, a satire so potent it could physically curdle milk and raise boils on a man's face. His poem denounced Bres's lack of generosity, his wretched hospitality, and his failure as a ruler. This verbal curse carried the weight of divine judgment, formally stripping Bres of his legitimacy and giving voice to the fury of an entire people. The poetic condemnation was the spark. The rebellion it ignited would eventually force the beautiful, despised tyrant from his throne and send him fleeing back to his Fomorian family, not as a bridge for peace, but as a vengeful herald of the total war that was now inevitable. In the stark and unwelcoming hall of King Bres, a profound cultural violation was about to ignite a revolution. the renowned poet Quapa arrived at court, an event that should have been a celebration of artistry and a reaffirmation of the king's generosity. A poet's visit was a moment for a ruler to showcase his wealth and magnanimity, to be praised in verse that would immortalize his glory. Instead, Quapa was met with a stunning display of contempt. He was given a cramped, drafty chamber to sleep in, a space so small and inhospitable it was an insult in itself. The final indignity came at meal time, where instead of a lavish feast, the poet was presented with 3 dry, unadorned cakes served on a single, bare platter. This wasn't just poor hospitality, it was a deliberate and calculated snub, a complete rejection of the most sacred social contract between a ruler and his people. For Quapa and for all of Celtic society, this was an unforgivable transgression. In their world, words were not mere sounds, they were tangible forces that could shape reality, bless crops, or curse a man's lineage. And among all verbal arts, satire held a uniquely terrifying power. It was considered a form of magical warfare, a weaponized poetry that could inflict physical and spiritual harm. A well-crafted satire, backed by the justified anger of its creator, was believed to have the power to raise boils on a person's face, to cause their crops to fail, or to curdle milk in the udders of their cows. It was a tool of ultimate social judgment, a way for a poet, as the guardian of truth and tradition, to strip a person of their honor and standing, effectively rendering them an outcast. Drawing upon this ancient and formidable power, Quapa did not simply complain. He crafted a response that would echo through history. Standing before the court, he unleashed a blistering, formal satire against King Bres. His poem laid bare the king's failures with surgical precision, highlighting his wretchedness, his lack of generosity, and his fundamental unworthiness to rule. Each line was a hammer blow against the king's legitimacy. The satire concluded with a devastating curse, a pronouncement that without food quickly on a dish, without a cow's milk for a calf, without a man's habitation after darkness remains, without paying a company of storytellers, let that be Bres's condition. This was a poetic invocation of emptiness and desolation, wishing upon the king the very state of lack he had inflicted upon his people. The effect was immediate and electric. The official, verbal stripping of Bres's kingship gave the Tuatha Dé Danann and the collective courage they needed. The poet's words had made their private suffering public and had legitimized their grievances. Emboldened by this act of defiance, a delegation of the most prominent leaders, including the wise and powerful Dagda, finally confronted Bres directly. They presented him with an ultimatum: abdicate the throne immediately. The power of Quapa's satire had broken the spell of fear and compliance. Faced with the unified wrath of his people and the potent curse now upon him, the despised king had no choice but to relinquish his crown. However, in a final act of arrogance, Bres demanded a stay of 7 years, supposedly to gather his personal wealth before he would formally leave. The Tuatha Dé, perhaps exhausted or wanting a clean end to the conflict, agreed. But Bres had no intention of simply leaving in peace. The moment he was free, he fled across the sea not to gather his belongings, but to rally his Fomorian kindred, seeking a massive army to reclaim by brutal force the throne he had just lost to the power of words. With their false king deposed and the threat of a Fomorian invasion looming, the Tuatha Dé Danann found themselves in a desperate situation, leaderless and vulnerable. Their salvation, however, would not come from a new face, but from the restoration of a familiar and noble one. The rightful king, Nuada, had been living in the shadows, his spirit as wounded as his body. But the very society that had cast him out for his imperfection now turned to its most brilliant healers and artisans to make him whole again. This task fell to Dian Sate, the god of medicine and a master physician, who approached the challenge with a blend of fierce pride and formidable skill. He crafted for Nuada a replacement hand and arm, not of flesh and bone, but fashioned from the finest, most polished silver. This was no simple prosthetic. It was a work of breathtaking artistry, a fully articulated limb with moving fingers that could grasp a sword's hilt and function with near-perfect precision. With this magnificent silver arm, Nuada was no longer blemished. He was transformed, a king reforged in precious metal, a living symbol of his people's resilience and ingenuity. The council, seeing his physical perfection restored, immediately reinstated him as the High King, a move that instantly restored morale and a sense of rightful order to the disheartened Tuatha Dé Danann. Yet, the story of the Silver Arm holds a deeper, more tragic layer, one that speaks to the destructive nature of envy. Dayan Sait was not the only healer in the family. His son, Maich, possessed an even greater gift, a profound and intuitive understanding of the body's mysteries that surpassed his father's more mechanical prowess. Where Dayan Sait had used metal to replace what was lost, Maich sought to truly heal. He gently removed the silver arm, and through the use of powerful incantations and the application of herbs grown from the earth itself, he performed a miracle. He regenerated Nuada's original hand, flesh, blood, and sinew, restoring the king to his complete and natural self. This act of profound healing should have been a moment of celebration, the ultimate victory over injury. Instead, it ignited a bitter and fatal jealousy in Dayan Sait, feeling that his own achievement had been utterly overshadowed and devalued by his son's superior magic. His pride curdled into a murderous rage. In a series of violent attacks, he struck his son on the head with a sword, each blow cutting deeper, but with each wound, Maich's incredible power healed himself. Finally, Dayan Sait delivered a fourth blow that pierced straight to his son's brain, a wound that even Maich could not survive. This heartbreaking tale of familial strife serves as a potent reminder that even among the gods, the most dangerous conflicts can arise from within, a tragic counterpoint to the unity they were desperately trying to forge against their external enemies. Nonetheless, the result was undeniable. Nuada Nuada of the Silver Arm was once again the undisputed High King of the Tuatha Dé Danann, whole in the eyes of their laws and his people. His return to the throne was a direct and unequivocal declaration of independence from the Fomorians. Under the tyrannical Bres, the kingdom had become a satellite state, a tributary to the monstrous race from across the sea. By restoring their legitimate, purely Tuatha Dé king, the people were loudly announcing that they would no longer submit. They were reclaiming their sovereignty, their dignity, and their destiny. This act made the coming war absolutely inevitable. The Fomorians, led by the vengeful Bres who had fled to them, would never accept this outcome. They had grown accustomed to the wealth flowing from Ireland and would not tolerate this rebellion. They would come to crush the Tuatha Dé Danann, to reinstall their puppet king, and to enslave the land once and for all. The restoration of the true king was not just a political shift, it was the first battle cry in a war that was now unavoidable, setting the stage for a confrontation that would require more than just a king. It would demand a champion. Yet even with their rightful king restored and their resolve steeled, the Tuatha Dé Danann faced a stark reality. The Fomorians were not a mere army, they were a tidal wave of primordial terror, a force so overwhelming that courage alone would not be enough to turn them back. They needed more than a king, they needed a savior, a leader of such unparalleled ability that he could unite their diverse talents and focus them into a single, unstoppable weapon. This desperate hope was echoed in an ancient prophecy, a whisper of fate that promised deliverance. It was foretold that a remarkable figure would come to them, a being whose mastery over every art and craft would make him the ultimate champion, the one capable of leading them to victory against the crushing darkness of Balor and his horde. This prophecy was not just a comforting tale, it was a necessary article of faith, a lifeline for a people staring into the abyss. That prophecy found its breathtaking fulfillment in the form of a dazzling young stranger who appeared one day at the great gates of their royal fortress, Tara. His name was Lugh Lamfada, Lugh of the Long Arm, and his arrival was as audacious as it was unexpected. He was not announced by fanfares or heralds, but simply presented himself, radiating a confidence that was both captivating and disarming. The gatekeeper, tasked with turning away all but the most essential visitors in this time of crisis, challenged him immediately. "What skill do you possess?" The guard demanded, expecting to hear of a single, useful trade like weaponry or smithing. But Lugh's response began a legendary exchange that will be told for millennia. He did not offer one skill, he offered them all. With a calm and boastful air that was entirely justified, Lugh listed his qualifications one by one. "I am a master builder," he stated. The gatekeeper, unimpressed, replied that they already had a master builder within. Lugh simply smiled and moved to the next. "I am a champion smith, a harper whose music can move men to tears or laughter, a hero and warrior without peer, a poet and historian, a magician of great power, and a master physician." To each declaration, the gatekeeper gave the same stubborn response: "We have no need of you. We already have someone who possesses that skill." This was the moment Lugh had been waiting for. He posed the question that would change the course of history. "Then ask your king this," he said, his voice ringing with certainty. "Do you have any one man who is the master of all these arts at once?" The gatekeeper fell silent, for the answer was self-evident. They had many specialists, each a genius in their own field, but no single being who unified all knowledge, all power, all talent into one magnificent whole. Lugh was the Ildenak, the master of all arts, the living embodiment of the prophecy. He was not just another applicant, he was the missing piece, the singular force who could synergize their strengths and lead them not as a committee of experts, but as a unified front under one flawless commander. With this brilliant rhetorical move, the gates of Tara swung open, not for a supplicant, but for a savior. The stage was now set not just for a battle, but for a legend. Inside the great hall of Tara, a tense and expectant silence had fallen. The gatekeeper's message had been delivered, and all eyes were fixed on the confident young stranger who claimed to be the master of every art. King Nuada, restored to his throne and wary of any new disruption, decided to put this bold claim to the ultimate test. He ordered that their finest chess set, the Fidchel board, be brought forth. This was no simple game of strategy. It was a revered intellectual contest, a metaphor for warfare and kingship itself. To challenge Lugh, Nuada summoned their own undisputed champion of the mind, the wise and cunning Ogma, a warrior whose strength was matched only by his legendary intellect. The match began, and the assembled court watched breathless as the pieces moved across the board. Ogma played with a fierce and brilliant intensity, but Lugh's moves were transcendent, seeing layers of strategy that seemed to unfold from a deeper understanding of the game's very soul. Piece by piece, he countered, outmaneuvered, and finally checkmated the great Ogma, securing his first decisive victory not with a blade but with pure, unassailable wit. This intellectual conquest was merely the opening move in Lugh's campaign to win the confidence of the court. He next turned his attention to the physical world, to the raw, tangible power that would be needed on the battlefield. He called for a massive flagstone to be brought into the hall, a slab of stone so immense that it normally required 4 times 20 oxen to even budge it. The Tuatha Dé's own champion of strength, the mighty Ogma himself, stepped forward. With a tremendous grunt of effort, he strained and managed to heave the colossal stone out through the front gates of the fortress, a feat that drew gasps of admiration from the crowd. Lugh simply smiled. He walked over to the same stone, now lying outside the walls. He bent his knees, grasped its edges, and with what appeared to be effortless grace, he not only lifted it, he carried it back inside and set it perfectly in its original place. The demonstration was devastatingly clear. He possessed not just strength, but a master's control over it, a finesse that made raw power seem clumsy by comparison. But Lugh was far from finished. He understood that war is a symphony, not a single note, and he proceeded to demonstrate his mastery over every instrument. He took up the harp, and as his fingers danced across the strings, he didn't just play music, he commanded emotion itself. First came the gentra, the strain of joy, a melody so bright and uplifting that the entire court erupted in uncontrollable laughter and celebration. Then, without pausing, his hands shifted and the goldtry, the strain of sorrow, flowed forth a haunting, beautiful lament that brought every single person in the hall to tears, their hearts aching with a shared, profound grief. Finally, he transitioned into the suantry, the strain of sleep, a slow, gentle, and irresistibly soothing lullaby that caused the entire assembly, including the king and his champions, to fall into a deep and peaceful slumber right where they stood. When they awoke, blinking and bewildered, they knew they were in the presence of something truly divine. This was not entertainment, it was a display of profound emotional power, the kind that could bolster the courage of an entire army or lull an enemy into a fatal complacency. His exhibition continued, each feat more impossible than the last. He demonstrated a speed that defied the eye, moving like a blur across the courtyard. He wielded a sword with a skill that made their best warriors look like novices, his blade becoming an extension of his will. He recited poetry with a bard's perfect memory and a prophet's insight, recounting the entire history of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the future that might await them. He worked metal with the skill of a master smith, crafted healing potions with the knowledge of a physician, and wove spells of protection and illusion that astonished their most powerful druids. One by one, he sought out the supreme specialist in each field and didn't just match them, he surpassed them, absorbing their art and elevating it to a level they had never conceived was possible. The message was now undeniable, and the court's initial skepticism had melted into pure, awestruck reverence. They were not just witnessing a talented individual, they were witnessing the living embodiment of their prophecy, the singular being who contained the totality of their culture's power. King Nuada, with the wisdom of a restored sovereign, recognized the truth before him. He knew that to face the formless, chaotic threat of the Fomorians, they needed a leader who was not limited to a single perspective, a commander who could think like a strategist, fight like a champion, inspire like a bard, and plan like a magician all at once. Rising from his throne, Nuada did not merely offer Lugh a place in his army. In a move that stunned the assembly, he immediately offered him the throne itself, believing that only such a complete leader could rightfully be king. But Lugh, in a display of stunning political wisdom, refused. His purpose was not to usurp the rightful line of kings, but to serve and protect it. He declared that he would lead their forces and plan their war, but he would do so under King Nuada's banner. He would be their champion, their strategist, and the architect of their salvation. In that moment, the fractured court became unified, their hope crystallized into a single, dazzling point of light named Lugh. Planning for the greatest war in their history could now truly begin. Lugh understood that victory against a foe like the Fomorians could never be won by a single champion, no matter how talented. This was a war that would require the complete and unified strength of an entire people, their skills, their magic, and their wisdom all woven together into a single, unbreakable strategy. His first act as the newly appointed war leader was not to drill troops or inspect blades, but to convene a council of the most brilliant and powerful minds among the Tuatha Dé Danann. He sought out the great druids, the master craftsmen, and the venerable wise ones, knowing that their knowledge would be the true foundation upon which their hope for freedom was built. At the heart of this gathering was the Dagda, the good god, a figure of immense paradox and power. He was the father of the tribe, a being of prodigious strength and appetite, yet also the master of magic and the keeper of the bottomless cauldron of plenty. His club was so massive that one end could kill 9 men with a single blow, while the other end possessed the magical power to restore the dead back to life. The Dagda represented the essential life force of the land itself, both its destructive and its regenerative powers. Lugh knew that the Dagda's deep, earthy wisdom and his connection to the very cycles of life and death would be indispensable. Alongside him stood Goibniu, the divine smith, whose hammer never missed its strike. He was the master of the forge, the one who would craft the unbreakable spears and swords that would never shatter in battle. But his role extended far beyond the anvil. He was also the brewer of an otherworldly ale that granted immortality to any warrior who drank it, making him the literal source of their army's invincibility. This council was a profound reflection of the Celtic understanding of warfare. To them, a battle was not merely a contest of physical strength. It was a complex tapestry woven from strategy, prophecy, psychology, and sacred magic. The druids were not passive observers. They were active participants whose arts could shape the very outcome. They could summon mists to conceal entire armies. They could chant spells to bolster the courage of their own side while sowing terror and confusion in the hearts of the enemy. They could read the future in the flight of birds or the patterns of clouds, offering crucial intelligence that could turn the tide. The planning session led by Lugh was therefore a multifaceted operation. They discussed not just troop movements and supply lines, but also the precise magical incantations needed to counter Balor's evil eye, the poetic satires that could demoralize the Fomorian champions, and the prophetic dreams that might reveal a hidden weakness in their foe's alliance. A critical part of their strategy focused on the fragile coalition that propped up Fomorian power. Lugh was acutely aware that their enemies' forces were not a monolith. They were a collection of disparate monstrous clans held together by fear, greed, and the overwhelming presence of Balor. The council began to formulate plans to exploit these fractures. They devised psychological operations using stealth and cunning to spread dissent among the Fomorian ranks, to turn their allies against each other, and to make them question the very leadership they followed. The goal was to break the Fomorian alliance from within before a single spear was ever thrown, to make their monstrous army crumble under the weight of its own internal suspicions and rivalries. This was warfare on a cosmic scale, a chess game where the pieces were gods and monsters, and the moves were made with spells as well as spears. Under Lugh's masterful coordination, every asset was being marshaled, every possibility considered. The quiet deliberations in the council chamber were, in their own way, the true opening salvo of the war to come. With their grand strategy set and every asset marshaled, Lugh and the Tuatha Dé Danann knew they needed one critical advantage before the armies clashed: time. They needed to delay the inevitable Fomorian assault to complete their preparations and allow their champions to forge the magical weapons that would decide the war. To pull off this audacious stunt, they required a diplomat who was equal parts cunning, intimidating, and utterly unpredictable. There was only one choice: the Dagda. His mission was a masterpiece of misdirection. Publicly, he was to march directly into the heart of the enemy camp as an ambassador, formally demanding a temporary truce and a halt to the crushing tribute. Secretly, his true objective was to act as a spy, assessing the enemy's strength, their morale, and their plans, all while lulling them into a false sense of security with a performance of seemingly simple-minded gluttony. The Dagda, in all his overwhelming presence, was the perfect agent for this role. He arrived at the Fomorian encampment not with the sleekness of a covert operative, but with the boisterous confidence of a giant. The Fomorians, led by the vengeful Bres, looked upon him with a mixture of contempt and cruel amusement. Seeing an opportunity to humiliate this ambassador of their enemies, they decided to mock him by exploiting his legendary, insatiable appetite. In a grand gesture of insulting hospitality, they constructed a colossal porridge pit, a cavernous hole in the ground into which they poured 80 measures of milk, 80 measures of meal, and entire sides of bacon and goats, creating a gargantuan, bubbling stew fit for 100 men. They handed the Dagda a massive spoon so huge that a man and a woman could lie together in its bowl, and they challenged him to eat it all, believing the task to be impossible and certain to end in his hilarious public failure. What followed was one of the most iconic and hilarious scenes in all of mythology. The Dagda accepted the challenge with grinning relish. he plunged his enormous spoon into the pit and began to eat. He consumed the entire monstrous feast, scraping the very bottom of the pit clean, and even using his giant finger to scoop up the last clinging bits of porridge. The Fomorians watched in stunned, horrified silence as their joke backfired spectacularly. This was no mere display of gluttony, it was a breathtaking exhibition of raw, primordial power. By consuming this absurd abundance, the Dagda was symbolically demonstrating his capacity to contain and overcome the very oppression the Fomorians represented their consumption of Ireland's bounty. He emerged from the pit with his enormous belly swollen to a comical degree, so full that he could barely waddle, his belt loosened and his body a walking testament to his victory. The act perfectly sold his disguise as a simple, appetite-driven fool, allowing the Fomorians to completely underestimate the sharp mind operating behind his satisfied grin. Having thoroughly disarmed the enemy with his performance, the Dagda then put the second part of his cunning plan into motion. He noticed the daughter of the Fomorian king, a woman of considerable influence and beauty named Indech. Using the charm and authority that lay beneath his coarse exterior, he seduced her, drawing her away from the campfire and into a private encounter. This was far more than a romantic dalliance, it was a calculated intelligence operation. In the intimacy of their meeting, he skillfully extracted crucial information from her, learning the Fomorians' battle plans, their strengths, their internal divisions, and perhaps most importantly, the secret weaknesses of their greatest champions. He turned a moment of passion into a masterclass in espionage, gathering the vital intelligence the Tuatha Dé Danann desperately needed. His mission was an unqualified success. He had secured the temporary delay they needed, he had lulled the enemy into a false sense of superiority, and he was returning home not just with a full stomach, but with the secrets that could win the war. While Lugh's brilliant mind mapped out the grand strategy and the Dagda's formidable presence secured them precious time, the true backbone of the coming victory was being forged not on the battlefield, but in the workshops and sacred spaces scattered across the land. The Tuatha Dé Danann knew that courage alone would shatter against the monstrous forms of the Fomorians. They needed an edge that was both tangible and supernatural. This edge came from their divine craftsmen, a trio of supernatural artisans whose collective efforts essentially created the world's first magical arms industry, transforming their entire civilization into a weapon-making machine. At the heart of this industrial effort was Goibniu, the god of the forge and the master smith whose name would become synonymous with metalworking for centuries. His role was absolutely critical. While other smiths might craft fine blades, Goibniu's work was in a class of its own, infused with a power that transcended mere craftsmanship. He did not simply make spears and swords, he forged instruments of destiny. It was said that every spearhead he hammered on his anvil possessed two unbreakable enchantments. First, it would never miss its target. Once thrown, the weapon became an extension of the thrower's will, guided by an unseen force to find its mark with uncanny precision. Second, and more devastatingly, a single blow from this weapon was always fatal. A mere scratch from a Goibniu forged blade was enough to guarantee death, making every Tuatha Dé warrior a lethally efficient instrument of war. His hammer never missed a strike on the anvil, and by extension, the weapons he created never missed their mark in battle. He worked tirelessly, and with the help of his assistants, he could produce a perfectly enchanted spearhead with just 3 strikes of his mighty hammer, churning out an endless supply of these perfect magical armaments. But a spear is more than just a pointy piece of metal. It requires a shaft to throw it and a shield to guard the one who wields it. This vital task fell to Lugh, the divine carpenter and wheelwright. While Goibniu worked with fire and metal, Lugh mastered wood and form. His workshop was a symphony of precise cutting and shaping, where he crafted the perfectly balanced spear shafts for Goibniu's deadly points. He also produced shields at an astonishing rate, creating sturdy, reliable protection for the entire army. The lore tells us his output was nothing short of miraculous. He could fashion 3 sets of hardwood shafts and shields with just a single stroke of his axe. This incredible efficiency meant that the Tuatha Dé Danann were not only armed with flawless weapons, but were also fully equipped with the tools of defense, creating a complete military package through this divine assembly line. The collaboration between the smith and the carpenter ensured that every warrior was a fully functional, perfectly equipped combat unit. However, even with unbreakable weapons and perfect shields, war inevitably brings injury and exhaustion. This is where the third pillar of their magical industry came into play, though his role was handled by a figure already burdened by tragedy. While the outline mentions Dian Sate as the brewer, his primary domain was actually healing, and his most crucial contribution was a magical well. After his horrific murder of his own son Maich, the task of providing invigoration and healing fell to him and his daughter Ermid. Together, they created the legendary Well of Slain. Into this well, they would chant healing incantations and deposit herbs with incredible restorative properties. Any Tuatha Dé warrior who was wounded or killed in battle could be plunged into its waters. Those who were merely injured would be instantly healed, their wounds closing as if they had never been struck. But even more astonishingly, those who had been slain would be restored to full life, ready to return to the fray. This effectively granted the entire army a form of functional immortality on the battlefield. To combat fatigue, a separate supply of magical ale, likely brewed by Goibniu, who was also a master brewer, was provided. This special drink did not cause drunkenness, but instead acted as a powerful tonic, instantly erasing all weariness and filling the warrior with renewed vigor and strength. This trifecta of magical support, perfect defense from Goibniu, perfect equipment from Lugh, and perfect resilience from the healers, meant that the Tuatha Dé Danann could fight a war of attrition indefinitely. They could not be disarmed, their weapons could not fail, and their soldiers could not be permanently killed or worn down. This was the ultimate strategic advantage, turning their entire people into an unstoppable, self-renewing force. Yet the most terrifying weapon in the druidic arsenal was not a storm or a shaking mountain, but the power of psychological warfare, and its master was the bard Fir Bolg, son of Mamwa. A bard's satire could raise boils, but in the context of total war, their poetry could be sharpened into a blade that severed an enemy's will to fight. Fir Bolg promised an incantation so potent it would drain the very strength from the limbs of every Fomorian warrior. He vowed to recite a poem that would cause the blood to literally drain from their bodies, leaving them pale, weak, and trembling before a single blow was ever struck. This was magic that targeted the spirit, a curse of profound despair and physical decay, meant to break the monstrous horde's morale before the lines even met. The combined strategy was a masterpiece of multi-layered assault. The land itself would revolt beneath the Fomorians' feet, the sky would rain hellfire upon their heads, and their own bodies and minds would betray them from within. This meticulous magical preparation ensured the battle would be fought on a plane far beyond the physical, making the very air and earth of Mag Tuired an extension of the Tuatha Dé Danann's indomitable will. While the druids wove their spells and the smiths hammered their deadly art, the warriors of the Tuatha Dé Danann were not idle. They understood that grand strategy and magical weapons, though vital, would ultimately mean nothing without the raw courage and personal honor of the champions who would meet the enemy on the field. In the Celtic tradition, a battle was not just a clash of armies, it was a collection of individual duels, a stage for heroic boasts and personal vows that would echo in song for generations. At the forefront of these martial heroes stood Ogma, the tribe's undisputed champion of strength and eloquence, a warrior whose massive frame was matched only by the power of his words. Ogma was a figure of fascinating contradiction. He was celebrated as the inventor of Ogam, the elegant and mysterious tree alphabet of the Celts, a man deeply connected to the intellectual and poetic arts. Yet he was also the mightiest wrestler and strongest warrior among the gods, the one who daily shouldered a colossal bundle of firewood to keep the royal hearth burning. This fusion of brain and brawn made him the ideal Celtic hero, and as the war drums grew louder, he felt the weight of his role profoundly. He knew that to inspire the entire army, a champion must do more than just fight. He must make a promise so audacious that its fulfillment would become a legend in itself. Thus, in the great hall before the assembled host, with King Nuada and Lugh looking on, Ogma made his vow. He did not simply pledge to kill Fomorians, he set his sights on the highest possible prize. He swore a solemn oath that he would personally seek out and challenge Indech, the king of the Fomorians and the father of the very woman the Dagda had seduced for secrets. Ogma vowed that he would not only defeat this monstrous monarch in single combat, but would also strip from him his most prized possession, his legendary and undoubtedly enchanted sword. This was no casual boast, it was a binding obligation of honor. To break such a vow would bring everlasting shame upon himself and his entire family, a dishonor far worse than death. By proclaiming this goal so publicly, Ogma was painting himself into a corner from which the only exit was glorious victory or a hero's grave. This personal subplot, this focus on a specific rival and a specific trophy, was absolutely central to the Celtic concept of warfare. Battles were chaotic, but they were given meaning and narrative structure through these individual contests. A hero's vow gave the army a focal point, a personal drama to follow amidst the melee. The warriors would fight with one eye on their own survival and the other on Ogma's quest, their own morale soaring or falling with his success. The taking of a king's sword was also deeply symbolic. A ruler's weapon was an extension of his sovereignty and his personal power. To capture it was to not only defeat the man but to humiliate him and claim his authority for your own. Ogma wasn't just seeking to kill a king, he was seeking to dismantle his legacy and carry it home as a trophy for his people. This act exemplifies the powerful role of the boast in warrior culture. In our modern view, boasting is often seen as mere arrogance, but in the ancient world, it was a crucial social ritual. A public vow served multiple purposes. It committed the hero irrevocably to his task, it inspired his comrades by displaying supreme confidence, and it psychologically terrorized the enemy by proclaiming an inevitable defeat. Hearing that the Tuatha Dé's champion had sworn to take their king's head, and his sword would sow doubt and fear in the heart of every Fomorian soldier. Ogma's vow transformed the coming battle from an abstract conflict into a personal grudge match, adding a layer of human-scale drama to the epic, cosmic struggle between order and chaos, and ensuring that even amidst thousands of clashing soldiers, the fate of kings would be decided by the strength of a single hero's arm. On the eve of the cataclysmic battle, a palpable tension settled over the land, a silence so heavy it seemed to press down upon the very earth. While the Tuatha Dé Danann, fortified by Goibniu's immortal ale and their own grim resolve, made their final preparations, a different kind of dread crept into the heart of the Fomorian encampment. It was into this atmosphere of anxious anticipation that a new, terrifying presence arrived, one that needed no army and carried no visible weapon, for she was war itself incarnate. She was the Morrígan, the Phantom Queen, the ancient goddess of battle, fate, and sovereignty, and her arrival signaled that the conflict had already begun on a spiritual plane far beyond the understanding of mortal or even divine combatants. She did not appear to the Tuatha Dé first, but to their enemies, materializing from the gathering shadows like a condensation of every soldier's deepest fear. To the Fomorian king, Indech, she presented herself not as a mere woman, but as a spectral vision of immense and terrifying power. Her form seemed to shift and writhe, one moment a tall, fearsome warrior queen clad in battle gear, the next a gaunt and terrifying crone whose eyes held the emptiness of a battlefield grave. She was often depicted as a trio of sisters Bodibi, Matcha, and Anne, but in this moment she was a unified force of impending doom. She stood before Indech, and without threat or boast she began to chant. Her voice was not a shout but a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the bones of every listener, a poetic prophecy that laid bare the inevitable fate awaiting them. Her verses were a meticulous unraveling of their hope. She sang of their strength curdling into weakness, their monstrous forms falling like harvested grain, their king's glory extinguished and his prized sword claimed by a stronger hand. This was no simple prediction. It was a glom Dyson, a deadly satirical incantation that carried the weight of a curse. In the Celtic world, a poet's words had the power to shape reality, and the words of the supreme goddess of fate were absolute. As she spoke, a tangible wave of despair washed over the Fomorian host. The morale that Bres had struggled to build, the cruel confidence of Balor, the arrogance of Indech himself, all of it crumbled under the cold, undeniable truth of her prophecy. She was not just telling them they would lose, she was actively severing their connection to victory, draining their will to fight before a single blow had been landed. She became the embodiment of their own creeping doubt, and when she finished her chant and melted back into the night, she left behind an army already half defeated, its spirit broken by a truth it could not deny. Having sown the seeds of despair among her enemies, the Morrígan then traveled to the banks of the river Unius, a place sacred to the Tuatha Dé Danann. Here her visitation took on an entirely different yet equally chilling character. The warriors who saw her there witnessed a scene steeped in ancient symbolic power. The great goddess was kneeling in the shallow water, her hands moving methodically through the current, and what she washed was not linen or wool, but the bloodied armor and broken chariots of the soon-to-be slain. This was a classic fis or vision, a potent omen understood by every Celtic warrior. To see the washer at the ford was to know that death was near, but the crucial, terrifying detail was whose death she foretold. She was not cleaning the gear of the Tuatha Dé. She was cleansing the spoils of war, washing the blood from the armor of the Fomorians who would fall the next day. This grisly task was not meant to horrify the Tuatha Dé, but to inspire them with an unshakable certainty. Her presence was a divine guarantee of their victory. By performing this ritual, she was not merely predicting the outcome. She was actively presiding over it, preparing the way for the triumphant and confirming that the sovereignty of Ireland would be washed clean of the Fomorian blight. Her appearance served as the ultimate pep talk, a visceral, unforgettable sign that fate itself had chosen their side. The fear of death was replaced by the fierce joy of impending victory. Where she had left the Fomorians paralyzed with doubt, she filled the Tuatha Dé with a relentless, battle-frenzied certainty. The Morrígan, in her dual role, had perfectly balanced the scales of war before the first spear was ever thrown, ensuring that the battle would be won not just by strength of arms, but by the irresistible power of prophesied fate. The air itself seemed to tear apart with the first, earth-shaking roar of the charge. Two oceans of fury and purpose crashed together on the plain of Mag Tuired, the impact a thunderclap of splintering shields, screaming metal, and the raw, guttural cries of warriors giving themselves over to fate. The orderly battle lines dissolved in an instant into a whirling, chaotic maelstrom of individual struggles for survival. In this deafening storm of violence, the supernatural advantages of the Tuatha Dé Danann immediately made their grim presence known. The air hissed with the flight of Goibniu's spears, each one a sliver of certain death. These were not mere projectiles thrown with hope. They were guided agents of vengeance, arcing through the chaos with an uncanny, intelligent malice to find the throat or eye of a Fomorian warrior, their fatal magic ensuring that every single one found a home in flesh. Against this deadly rain, the chants of the Tuatha Dé druids wove a different kind of weapon, a subtle, pervasive magic that sapped the strength from Fomorian limbs and clouded their minds with confusion, making their massive frames feel heavy and their strikes slow and clumsy. Amidst this sprawling, horrific canvas of war, individual duels flared like lightning strikes, defining the narrative of the battle. True to the vow that had steeled the hearts of his people, the mighty Ogma carved a path of devastation through the Fomorian ranks. He was a whirlwind of focused fury, his strength amplified by the certainty of his oath. His target was not any common soldier. He fought with a singular purpose, his eyes scanning the chaotic press for one figure alone, Indech, the Fomorian king. When he finally found him, the clash was titanic. Indech, a monstrous giant of a ruler, met Ogma's charge with a roar, his own enchanted sword sweeping down in a blow meant to cleave the champion in two. But Ogma, a master of both word and warfare, was ready. He parried with a shock that sent vibrations through both their arms, and the real duel began. It was a brutal exchange of power and skill, a contest that seemed to momentarily clear a space around them as other combatants instinctively gave way. Ogma fought not just for victory, but for the symbol of it, the prized sword in Indech's hand. With a final, tremendous feat of strength and a clever feint, Ogma overpowered the king, wrenching the magnificent weapon from his grasp. In that moment, he fulfilled his jays, holding the king's own sovereignty aloft as a trophy. The defeat and humiliation of their leader sent a visible wave of despair through the nearby Fomorian lines. Their confidence dealt a crippling blow even as Ogma's triumph ignited the Tuatha Dé Danann with a fresh, ferocious hope. Yet for all the heroism and terror unfolding across the battlefield, the true pivot point of the entire conflict remained far from the fray, a monstrous icon of dread whose power was so absolute it had not yet been needed. Balor of the Evil Eye, the Fomorian king and their ultimate instrument of annihilation, had held his position at the rear, a silent, mountainous presence observing the chaos through his one good eye. The Fomorians fought with the desperate hope that their champions could secure victory without needing to unleash the cataclysm that was their king. But as the tide began to turn, as Ogma's triumph over Indech sent shockwaves through their ranks and the unkillable Tuatha Dé warriors pressed their advantage, the order was finally given. The time for restraint was over. Balor would enter the war. The process of preparing Balor's weapon was a ritual in itself, a terrifying spectacle that demanded the strength of multiple men. His destructive eye was not simply an organ he could open at will. It was a sealed horror, a biological weapon of mass destruction kept restrained by 7 heavy, leathery lids, each one sutured shut and latched with bands of cold iron. To open it was to unleash a plague upon the world. 4 of his strongest Fomorian attendants now approached him, their own monstrous forms dwarfed by his immense stature. Using massive iron poles hooked into the latches, they strained with all their might, their muscles bulging and sweat pouring from their brows as they began the slow, deliberate process of prying the great eyelid open. It was a grim countdown to oblivion, each creaking inch of lifted lid raising the stakes for every soul on the field. From the Tuatha Dé lines, a wave of pure, primal terror swept through the ranks as they saw what was happening. The legends of Balor's gaze were not mere campfire tales. They were a foundational fear passed down for generations. They knew what was coming. As the lid began to rise, a sickly, greenish-yellow light, thick and vaporous like poisonous mist, began to spill forth from the narrowing slit. Where that baleful light fell, the very fabric of life unraveled. The ground itself blackened and cracked, grass withering to dust in an instant. A group of Tuatha Dé warriors who hesitated for a second too long found themselves caught in the edge of the glow. Their battle cries died in their throats as their skin desiccated and cracked like ancient parchment, their armor rusting through in seconds, their bodies collapsing into piles of ash and bone before they could even raise their shields in a futile defense. His gaze did not just kill, it erased, it unmade, it returned matter to barren nothingness. The effect on the battle was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Fomorian advance, which had been wavering, now found a second wind surging forward behind this walking apocalypse. The Tuatha Dé Danann, moments before filled with the fervor of victory, were now thrown into a panic. Their magical spears were useless against a foe they could not approach. Their immortality meant nothing if they were utterly vaporized before they could be tossed into the healing well. No strategy, no amount of courage could stand against this. Balor began to sweep his head slowly from side to side, and with each movement, another entire swath of the Tuatha Dé army was simply wiped from existence, leaving behind a smoldering, barren scar on the land. He was not just a warrior, he was a force of nature, a walking extinction event. In mere moments, he had single-handedly reversed the course of the battle, pushing the forces of light to the very brink of total annihilation and proving why he was the most feared being in all of Celtic myth. The prophecy of victory now seemed a cruel joke, and the only hope lay in a single, impossible shot that had been foretold since the dawn of time. The tide of battle, so fiercely won by the courage of the Tuatha Dé Danann, was now catastrophically reversing. Balor's evil eye, that dreaded instrument of absolute annihilation, was being pried open, and with each inch the lid rose, a wave of incandescent death washed across the plain. Panic, pure and unadulterated, seized the ranks of the gods. Their magical spears were useless, their healing well irrelevant against a power that unmade existence itself. The prophecy of victory seemed to curdle into a cruel lie as Balor's gaze swept methodically, turning their strongest champions into smoldering ash and the very earth beneath their feet into a cracked, barren wasteland. In this moment of utter despair, all eyes, filled with terror and a flicker of desperate hope, turned to one figure, Lugh Lamfada. He stood not as a panicked warrior, but as a pillar of calm resolve, his mind processing the chaos with the cold precision of a master strategist. This was the confrontation that had been whispered in prophecy since his birth, the grandson destined to face his own grandfather. For Balor, in a cruel twist of fate, was Lugh's maternal grandfather. This familial connection was no coincidence of myth, it was the very engine of the prophecy. Years before, a seer had foretold that Balor would be slain by his own grandson. In a frantic attempt to avert this destiny, the paranoid Fomorian king had imprisoned his only daughter, Goibniu, in a crystal tower on a remote island, isolating her from all contact. But the fates are not so easily thwarted. A mysterious visitor, some say the Dagda himself in disguise, found his way into the tower, and from that union, Lugh was born and smuggled away to be raised in secret. Every step of Lugh's life, his mastery of every art, had led him inexorably to this single, world-altering moment, to become the fulfillment of his grandfather's deepest fear. Lugh understood that a direct assault was suicide. He could not meet that gaze head-on, no one could. His victory would rely not on brute strength, but on speed, precision, and a profound understanding of the weapon he faced. He saw the agonizingly slow process of the eyelid being raised by its attendants, the beam of death focusing into a killing ray. He realized the weapon had a fatal flaw. It required a line of sight. As Balor's head began to turn toward the heart of the Tuatha Dé forces, Lugh moved. He was a blur of motion, a darting spark of light against the encroaching darkness, using the chaos of the battlefield and the bodies of fallen warriors as cover to close the distance at an angle, avoiding the direct path of that horrifying gaze. Positioning himself directly in front of the giant, but at a safe distance, Lugh reached for his sling. This was not a common soldier's weapon, but a tool of shepherds and hunters, a humble instrument that in his hands became a divine catalyst. He loaded it not with an ordinary river stone, but with a tathlum, a magical projectile specially crafted for this purpose. The stories vary on its origin. Some say it was a stone imbued with the power of the druids, while others claim it was a hardened ball fashioned from the blood of sacrificed heroes, charged with a singular, lethal purpose. As the great eyelid reached its apex and Balor's destructive eye fixed upon him, Lugh did not flinch. He began to whirl the sling over his head, building a terrifying velocity. The moment hung in the balance, a fraction of a second where the entire fate of Ireland trembled. Balor's eye glowed, gathering its venomous power to erase Lugh from creation. But Lugh was faster. With the unerring aim of a master, he released the tathlum. It shot forth like a bolt of lightning, a streak of concentrated destiny that flew true to its mark. It did not strike the eyelid or the socket. It flew directly into the open, glowing eye itself. The impact was not merely physical, it was catastrophic. The magical stone, carrying the combined will of the Tuatha Dé Danann and the power of prophecy, pierced the vile orb and with unimaginable force was driven straight through the back of Balor's gigantic skull. The effect was instantaneous and grotesquely poetic. The very poison Balor meant to unleash upon the Tuatha Dé was now turned against his own army. The beam of destruction, its source ruptured, erupted backward out of his head in a violent, uncontrolled shockwave. This reverse blast of baleful energy shot directly into the densely packed ranks of the Fomorian champions and generals who had been standing behind their king, confident in his invincibility. They were utterly obliterated, vaporized where they stood. The force of the blow was so immense that it killed the attendants holding the eyelid open and sent Balor's colossal body crashing to the ground, shaking the very foundations of the earth. The single most powerful being in the Fomorian host, their ultimate weapon, had been destroyed by his own power, turned against him by the grandson he tried and failed to erase from destiny. With their king and his devastating weapon gone in one stunning blow, the heart of the Fomorian resistance was torn out, and their monstrous army began to utterly and completely rout. The colossal form of Balor crashing to the earth was more than just the death of a king. It was the shattering of an idea. The Fomorians' entire world, built upon a foundation of fear and his overwhelming power, disintegrated in that single, deafening moment. The shockwave that had vaporized their own rear guard sent a tremor of pure, unadulterated terror through the remaining monstrous ranks. Their invincible champion, their ultimate weapon, the very reason for their confidence, had been extinguished by a single stone from a sling. The will to fight, already strained by the Morrigan's prophecy and the Tuatha Dé's unkillable resilience, snapped completely. What had been a disciplined, if brutal, army instantly devolved into a mindless, panicked stampede. A great, guttural roar of triumph erupted from the Tuatha Dé Danann, a sound that washed away the last vestiges of their own fear and transformed it into vengeful fury. Led by Lugh, who stood radiant amidst the swirling dust, they surged forward as one. This was no longer a battle, it was a hunt. The magical spears of Goibniu, which had never missed their mark, now found the backs of fleeing giants. The immortal warriors, their fatigue erased by the special brew, pursued their enemies with relentless, terrifying energy. They chased the Fomorians across the scarred plain, across rivers and through forests, giving them no quarter. The goal was not merely to win the day, but to ensure this monstrous threat could never rise again. They drove them into the sea, into the very waves from which their oppression had first emerged, cutting them down until the tide itself ran red and the beaches were littered with the broken forms of the chaotic horde. It was a total, absolute, and definitive victory, the kind sung about for millennia, a cleansing of the land so thorough it felt like a new creation. As the last echoes of combat faded and the final Fomorian was driven into the Western Ocean, an immense, profound silence descended upon Mag Tuired, broken only by the heavy breathing of the victorious and the gentle sigh of the wind. Then a different sound began to rise, starting as a low hum and swelling into a powerful, joyous crescendo. It was the sound of a people unchained, the Tuatha Dé Danann, who had lived for so long under the shadow of tyranny and the weight of impossible tribute, threw down their weapons and embraced. They laughed and wept, hugging comrades they had seen fall only to rise again from the healing well. They raised Lugh and Ogma and the Dagda onto their shoulders, their cheers shaking the very foundations of the land. The oppressive burden of Bres's rule, the constant dread of Fomorian raids, the fear for their children and their future, it was all over, swept away in a single, glorious tide of freedom. The air, once thick with the stench of fear and poison, now smelled of rain-washed earth and hope. They had not just won a battle, they had secured their sovereignty, their right to exist and flourish in the land they loved, and the sheer, unbridled relief of that moment was a victory in itself. But as the final cries of the fleeing Fomorians faded into the distance and the initial, explosive joy of triumph began to settle, a new, somber reality descended upon the plain of Mag Tuired. The adrenaline that had fueled the pursuit ebbed away, leaving in its wake a profound and aching exhaustion, both of the body and the spirit. The celebratory shouts died in throats that now felt too tight as the victorious Tuatha Dé Danann finally stopped to truly look upon the cost of their freedom. The field, once a vibrant landscape, was now a horrifying canvas of war's true toll, a churned and bloody mire littered with the broken forms of friend and foe alike. The air, which had moments before been electric with the thrill of the rout, grew heavy and still, thick with the iron scent of blood and the low, agonized moans of the dying. This was not a clean victory, it was a salvation purchased with unimaginable sacrifice, and the price was now laid bare for all to see. Among the countless losses, one figure symbolized the profound cost more than any other. In the final, chaotic stages of the battle, as the Fomorians broke and ran, their champion Esreng, the very warrior who had taken Nuada's hand in the first great conflict, made a last, desperate stand. In the swirling melee, he found his old rival, the restored High King. Nuada, fighting with the valor that had defined his reign, engaged the Fir Bolg hero one final time. Though Esreng was ultimately struck down, in his last moments he delivered a mortal blow to the king. The noble Nuada Ergetlam, he who had been made whole again only to lead his people to freedom, now lay mortally wounded upon the earth he had fought so hard to protect. His magnificent silver arm, a symbol of his resilience and his people's ingenuity, lay cold and still against his side, a stark contrast to the vibrant lifeblood seeping from his wound. His death was a devastating blow, a cruel twist of fate that reminded everyone that even a restored and rightful king was not immune to the random, indifferent cruelty of war. The victory felt suddenly hollow, the celebration premature as the father of their tribe slipped away. The process of reclaiming the field was a grim and sacred duty. The magical well of slain saw constant use, its restorative waters bringing back many of the Tuatha Dé slain. Yet even its power had limits. It could not revive those whose bodies had been utterly obliterated by Balor's gaze or dismembered beyond recognition. For every warrior who rose, shaking and whole from the well's depths, there were others for whom the only rituals left were those of mourning. The survivors moved through the carnage, their faces etched with a complex mixture of relief, grief, and a weary numbness. They turned over the bodies of Fomorian giants, not with hatred now, but with a strange, solemn respect for the shared tragedy of conflict. The task of clearing the field was immense, a physical manifestation of the long emotional reckoning that was only just beginning. This hard-won peace was not a return to the way things were before. It was the painful foundation upon which an entirely new world would have to be built, a world forever marked by the immense cost of its own creation. Amidst the grief and the grim task of tending to their fallen, a new and urgent question began to take shape among the survivors of the Tuatha Dé Danann. They were victorious, but they were leaderless. The noble Nuada, their twice-crowned king, lay cold on the field he had died to liberate. The prophecy had been fulfilled, the monstrous threat eradicated, but a kingdom cannot be built upon a power vacuum. In the wake of such cataclysmic change, the people instinctively turned to the one who had engineered their salvation, the singular figure whose brilliance had guided them through the darkness. They turned to Lugh Lamfada, the Ildenak, and with a single, unified voice, they acclaimed him as their new High King. This was not a coronation born of conquest or sly political maneuvering. It was a recognition of earned merit and a collective sigh of relief. Lugh had already proven himself the master of every art, a leader who could think strategically, fight courageously, and inspire poetically. He was the living embodiment of the complete ruler, and his refusal to take the throne from Nuada earlier only solidified the people's trust in his character and wisdom. They knew that his leadership was not driven by a hunger for power, but by a profound sense of duty and a genuine love for his people. His ascent to the kingship felt less like a transfer of power and more like a natural, inevitable conclusion to the saga they had just lived through. He was the hero who had saved them, and now he was the king who would guide them into the future. Lugh's first acts as king were a direct and powerful repudiation of the oppressive era that had come before. He immediately and permanently abolished the brutal system of tribute that Bres had instituted and the Fomorians had enforced. The crippling demands for 2/3 of their children, their milk, and their grain were cast aside, declared null and void for all time. This was the most tangible and immediate relief for the common people, the assurance that the fruit of their labor would now belong to them, that their families would be safe, and that the specter of having their children stolen away had finally been banished. It was a declaration that the days of serving parasitic overlords were over. The age of self-determination and prosperity for the Tuatha Dé Danann had truly begun. But Lugh's vision extended far beyond merely undoing the wrongs of the past. He understood that a lasting peace required more than just the absence of war. It required the active cultivation of culture, craft, and community. Drawing upon his mastery of every art, he fostered a true golden age for his people. He encouraged the smiths, like the great Goibniu, to turn their skills from forging weapons of war to creating beautiful artifacts, exquisite jewelry, and sturdy tools for farming and building. He tasked the carpenters and builders with constructing not just fortresses, but great halls for feasting and storytelling, and comfortable homes for families to thrive. The bards and poets who had once sung satires of rebellion were now commissioned to compose epic poems celebrating their history and the heroes of Mag Tuired, ensuring the memory of their struggle and their hard-won freedom would be passed down through countless generations. Under his just and insightful rule, the land itself seemed to respond. The blights and famines that had plagued the reign of Bres vanished, replaced by fields overflowing with grain and pastures thick with healthy cattle. The seasons turned with a renewed regularity, and a sense of harmony settled over Ireland. The Tuatha Dé Danann, who had arrived on the island as mysterious invaders in a cloud of mist, now fully embodied their role as its divine guardians and protectors. They became the gods of the Irish landscape, their names given to its rivers, mountains, and ancient sites. Lugh's kingship secured their place in the mythic fabric of the nation, transforming them from victorious invaders into the benevolent, powerful deities who would watch over the land and its people for all time, their story forever intertwined with the very soul of Ireland. Yet beyond the thrilling clashes of gods and monsters, the Battle of Mag Tuired endures as a foundational myth because it operates on a far deeper, symbolic level. It is a powerful allegory for the eternal human struggle to establish order, culture, and sovereignty against the ever-present threat of chaos, oppression, and the untamed wild. The two opposing forces are perfectly crafted to represent this cosmic conflict. The Tuatha Dé Danann are not merely skilled, they are the very embodiment of civilization itself. Their mastery extends to all the arts that define a cultured society: law, medicine, poetry, metalworking, and architecture. They are led by a king whose legitimacy is tied to his physical wholeness and his generosity, reflecting the ancient belief that the rightful ruler and the land are one. A fertile, prosperous kingdom requires a morally and physically perfect sovereign. Their four legendary treasures are not just powerful plot devices, they are symbols of a functioning, abundant society. A stone that affirms true leadership, a sword that guarantees justice and protection, a spear that signifies unstoppable will in battle, and a cauldron that ensures no one goes hungry. They represent a world governed by skill, knowledge, and benevolent order. In stark, terrifying contrast, the Fomorians are primordial chaos given form. They are not a society but a predatory horde, a collection of misshapen giants who represent the harsh, indifferent, and consuming forces of nature. Their mismatched limbs, single arms, single legs, single eyes, are a physical manifestation of imbalance and dysfunction. They do not build, create, or cultivate, they only take. Their oppressive system of tribute, demanding 2/3 of the island's children milk and grain, is the ultimate expression of a parasitic relationship with the land. They do not contribute to its vitality, they drain it, leaving nothing for the future. They are the embodiment of famine, stagnation, and the cruel winter that threatens the summer's bounty. Balor's evil eye is the perfect symbol of their essence, a form of destruction that is mindless, indiscriminate, and utterly barren, leaving only smoldering waste in its wake. The battle, therefore, is not just a war between two tribes. It is the story of agriculture defeating blight, of community defeating isolation, and of structured skill defeating raw, anarchic power. This victory established the very concept of sacred kingship and sovereignty in the Irish consciousness. The myth clearly illustrates that the right to rule is not inherited through simple bloodline but earned through character, generosity, and the unwavering protection of the people. The reign of the beautiful but selfish Bres serves as a dire warning of what happens when a king breaks the sacred contract of hospitality and generosity. His tyranny brings literal blight upon the land, proving that a bad king makes for a sickly kingdom. Conversely, the restoration of the generous Nuada and the rise of the multi-talented Lugh reaffirm that the land will only flourish under a true and rightful sovereign, one who embodies all the skills of his culture and uses them for the benefit of all. The battle's outcome permanently binds the fate of the Tuatha Dé Danann to the island of Ireland. They transition from being its conquerors to being its divine guardians, their essence woven into the rivers, mountains, and ancient sites. They become the Owls She, the people of the mounds, the powerful but benevolent spirits whose presence explains the beauty, mystery, and enduring spirit of the land itself. The Second Battle of Mag Tuired is ultimately Ireland's origin story for its own identity, a nation forged not by mere conquest, but by a hard-won covenant between a people, their rightful rulers, and the sacred land they are destined to protect. While the epic clash at Mag Tuired lives on primarily as a powerful story of cosmic struggle, its echoes are believed to resonate in the very soil of Ireland, particularly in the rugged landscape surrounding Moytirra in County Sligo. The name Moytirra itself is an anglicization of Mag Tuired, and for generations, local tradition has steadfastly identified this specific region, with its two distinctive plains separated by a ridge, as the hallowed ground where the Tuatha Dé Danann secured their destiny. This isn't merely a case of a name matching a story. The topography itself seems to whisper the legend. The area features two separate plains, east and west, divided by a rocky highland, a physical setup that beautifully mirrors the mythological account of two great battles fought on the same plain yet separated by a significant span of time. Standing there with the wind sweeping across the open terrain, it is remarkably easy to let your imagination fill the air with the sounds of clashing spears and the cries of gods and monsters, to picture Lugh taking aim or the Morrígan surveying the carnage. Archaeologists have explored the Moytirra area, uncovering evidence of ancient human activity that adds a fascinating layer of context to the myth. The region is rich with Neolithic and Bronze Age monuments, including court tombs, cairns, and stone circles, structures built by people for whom ritual, burial, and the sacredness of the land were paramount concerns. While no archaeological dig has unearthed a silver arm or the remains of a giant with a single eye, these ancient sites tell us that this was a landscape intensely inhabited and ritualized for thousands of years. It was a place of deep significance to the very communities who would eventually tell and retell the stories of the Tuatha Dé Danann. The myth doesn't need to be a literal historical account to be connected to history. it can be seen as a profound expression of how those ancient people understood their own past, projecting their memories of real conflicts, migrations, and struggles for dominance onto a grand divine canvas. The story gives meaning to the old stones and the shape of the hills, providing an epic explanation for the world they saw around them. Ultimately, the enduring power of the Battle of Mag Tuired lies not in its historical factuality but in its profound truth as a story. It exists in the powerful realm of cultural identity, a foundational narrative that helped the Irish people define themselves against outside forces and understand their relationship with their land. The oppressive, parasitic Fomorians arriving from across the sea could easily symbolize any number of real historical invaders or harsh natural challenges from famine to blight. The triumphant, skilled Tuatha Dé Danann, meanwhile, represent the ideal of a resilient, cultured, and sovereign people overcoming those trials. The myth provided a template for hope and resistance, a tale that said no matter how overwhelming the threat, be it a monstrous horde or a cruel overlord, courage, unity, and skill could prevail. It is a story that forged a spirit of independence and connected a people to their homeland through a shared, glorious, and deeply meaningful past, proving that the most powerful battles are often those fought not just with weapons, but with the stories we tell about who we are. And so, from the crushing weight of oppression under a tyrant king to the blinding terror of Balor's gaze, the Tuatha Dé Danann journeyed through fire and sacrifice to claim their glorious, hard-won victory. Their story is far more than an ancient tale of clashing gods. It is the very bedrock of Celtic identity, a mythic explanation for how order, culture, and sovereignty were wrestled from the jaws of chaos. It teaches us that true leadership is earned through generosity and skill, not taken by force, and that the resilience of a united people, armed with courage and wisdom, can overcome even the most monstrous of threats. This battle carved the soul of a nation into the Irish landscape, transforming the Tuatha Dé from conquering invaders into the benevolent guardians of the hills and rivers, their legend forever echoing in the wind that sweeps across the plain of Mag Tuired. To celebrate you, this incredible community, for joining us on these journeys into myth and helping us reach 1,000 subscribers, we're launching a massive giveaway filled with prizes worthy of the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves. One lucky winner will receive a stunning hardcover collection of Celtic myths to immerse yourself in these epic stories, a $50 Amazon gift card to fuel your next adventure, and an exclusive digital art print inspired by the legendary characters we explored today. Entering is simple. Just drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment from the Battle of Mag Tuired. Were you on the edge of your seat as Lugh made his impossible shot? Did the Morrigan's chilling prophecy send a shiver down your spine? Let us know. The giveaway is open now and closes 2 weeks from today, so be sure to get your entry in before the deadline. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for your incredible support, for subscribing, and for sharing your passion for mythology with us. If you love this deep dive into Celtic legend, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more adventures into the stories that shaped our world. Now let the cauldron of fate begin to swirl. Good luck to everyone entering the giveaway, and may your name be the one drawn from the digital